Thanks, Ruth. And before I begin, I want to thank Joe and all his team for organising this, and I also want to echo the sentiments of the previous speakers. I think it's important to say that you have amended the panel, and I think it's great that we're part of a gender-balanced panel, 50-50, which hopefully we'll see across public life and politics and society, and that's important that we advance that in all walks of public life. But thanks again for organising today and the event this week. It's great to be up in Donegal. The last time I was here was for a Gaelic football match a number of years ago, so it's good to be back in a different capacity. While there are those who may find it ironic that a nation whose people have been unfairly stereotyped as the Fighting Irish has been so much the forefront globally in advocating disarmament, non-alignment and military neutrality, I do not. I do not find it ironic at all, because we have done more than advocate. We have backed up our fine words with even finer actions through 60 years of peacekeeping operations that has sadly cost us some 87 lives. This is why there is nothing ironic at all that in a small nation that spent so long struggling for its own freedom and independence, feeling solidarity with other small nations and supporting a global system of laws and rules that guaranteed those freedoms. And I think it's important that we look at examples and look at the historical context of the question and what we're debating this week. In the Celtic world and in Gaelic Ireland, a type of brio or measure of manliness was associated with waging war. And the vagaries of our history, with its recurring themes of exile, loss and emigration, often conspired to ensure that over the centuries, wherever there was major conflict, Irish soldiers were combatants, either out of financial necessity or ideological belief. Many of us probably have a vague memory of learning about the wild geese in school. The Treaty of Limerick in 1691, which signalled the end of the Williamite War in Ireland and the departure of Patrick Sarsfield's Jacobite army, began a tradition of Irish regiments being incorporated into the armies of the great European powers. If the notion of the Fighting Irish sprang from early modern Europe, it was, however, nurtured in the United States at a time of great peril for the Union. Irish soldiers were to be found in abundance on both sides of the divide in the bloody conflict that was the American Civil War. And in the summer of 1963, almost exactly a century on from the Battle of Gettysburg, President John F. Kennedy visited his ancestral home in County Wexford. There he spoke about having only a few months previously visited the site of the battle in Pennsylvania. He was moved to tell his audience that he had seen the monument to commemorate fallen members of the Irish Brigade. President Kennedy used a large portion of his remarks to the Oireachtas to laud and encourage Ireland's role in international peacekeeping. President Kennedy said, "Your destiny lies not as a peaceful island in the sea of troubles, but as a maker and shaper of world peace." Praising Ireland for wisely pursuing an independent course of foreign policy, Kennedy envisaged Ireland's role as the vanguard of post-colonial nations. He said, and I quote, Ireland's role is unique, for every new nation knows that Ireland was the first of the small nations in the 20th century to win its struggle for independence, and that the Irish have traditionally sent their doctors and technicians and soldiers and priests to help other lands to keep their liberty alive. Ireland's struggle, to borrow Kennedy's phrase, as the first of the small nations in the 20th century to win its freedom is significant in tracing the evolution of Irish military neutrality. We know from World War I that the system of military alliances from the great powers in Europe had seen them entangle themselves into a massive conflict which resulted in the deaths of 10 million military personnel, including up to 50,000 Irish soldiers. A suspicion of military alliances, a desire to not become immersed in the conflicts of the so-called great powers, a distaste for imperialism, resentment against Britain, anti-war sentiment, a genuine wish to chart our own future, and manifestations of Irish sovereignty were competing and overlapping features of the successful anti-conscription campaign in Ireland in 1918. As the foreign policy of the fledgling Irish independent state developed in the Europe between the two world wars, These same features that I have listed as key elements of the 1918 broad-based, hugely populist anti-conscription campaign were integral to the shaping and evolution of Irish neutrality. On the 10th of September 1923, arising from the efforts of Desmond Fitzgerald, the Minister for External Affairs, the Irish Free State joined the League of Nations independently of Britain. The work of successive governments in this international forum and later in the United Nations has done much to emphasise that Ireland was autonomous with its own foreign policy and was not a mere annex of Britain. A lot of myths have taken root about Irish neutrality during World War II. Increasingly, the emergence of new historical research shows that the state's policy was more akin to non-belligerency in favour of the Allies, rather than a strict neutrality that placed the interests of the Axis and Allied combatants on a level playing pitch. Those who hold neutrality up as a sacred cow or an irreversible standard might be shocked at its reality in World War II and the extent of the support that Ireland gave Britain and the US, such as, for example, the unpublicised permission given to Allied military aircraft to use the Donegal air corridor and the decision to share Irish meteorological reports with the British and US authorities. Indeed, not many people know that a weather report shared by Ireland from Blacksod Lighthouse, County Mayo, convinced General Dwight D. Eisenhower to delay the D-Day invasion for 24 hours, a decision which averted military catastrophe and changed the course of the Second World War. I mention all of this to place my own thoughts and views on the direction in which we should steer future defence and security policy into a broad historical context. Looking back over our more recent political history, we can see that defence policy has been best discussed in the abstract and at worst as a means of creating differences. Past EU referenda in Ireland have seen some incredible red herrings thrown into the mix by campaigners whose view of the EU would be much closer to the Brexiteers in the UK than to mainstream political opinion in this country. We were told that ratifying the Nice Treaty meant Ireland was signing up to NATO. Who remembers the infamous "No to Nice, No to NATO" poster? And similarly, we were told that ratifying the Lisbon Treaty would see Irish people conscripted into a European army. Needless to say, none of that has happened. Prior to Christmas, the Dáil approved Ireland's joining the EU's PESCO military framework. This decision was supported by my own party, Fianna Fáil. There's no provision in the EU treaties for the creation of an EU-wide army, though many of the usual suspects who've opposed every European treaty are suggesting that this is the step towards a European army. Let's all be clear, PESCO is about security and cooperation. It's about defending Europe's shared borders and improving the capacity of the EU and Ireland to support international peace and security and to assist in crisis management, particularly humanitarian crises. It will ensure that our defence forces will have access to the best equipment and training during PESCO missions. At a political level, PESCO is about fostering EU inclusivity, something we badly need in this Brexit era. And PESCO is about ensuring that Europe provides humanitarian and compassionate global leadership. While PESCO is not, as I've said, about building a European army, it will help deepen European integration, and this is not something from which Ireland should recoil. As the UK resides from the EU, Ireland has chosen a different and wiser route, one which will strengthen our bonds with other European member states. The EU is beginning a new chapter, and there are opportunities and challenges open to us with Brexit facing the country. When Sean Lemass first set Ireland on a course for common market membership, he recognised that Europe was a new departure and we should be ready to embrace change, even in areas as sensitive as national security and neutrality. And in a 1962 interview with the New York Times, Lemass said, and I quote, "We recognise that a military commitment will be an inevitable consequence of our joining the common market, and ultimately we will be prepared to even yield the technical label of neutrality. We are prepared to go into this integrated Europe without any reservations as to how far this will take us in the field of foreign policy and defence," unquote. Lemass's successor, Jack Lynch, also argued that Ireland could not be neutral when it came to European defence. He said, and I quote, "Ireland will be interested in the defence of the territories embraced by the communities. There is no question of neutrality there," unquote. You can hear echoes of what Lamass and Lynch had to say 5 or 6 decades ago in what our current Taoiseach Leo Varadkar expressed in his speech to the European Parliament in January, saying that if Europe is worth building, it is worth defending, and it is hard to disagree with that viewpoint. I want us to have a full and frank debate on defence and security policy, but let it be based on a factual analysis of the real and current threats, and not one fuelled by any spurious analyses. Our end goal should be a defence policy that is pragmatic, deliverable, and built on firm and ethical principles. Bertie Ahern's decision to take Ireland into Partnership for Peace, a programme of practical bilateral cooperation between individual Euro-Atlantic partner countries and NATO, was a wise one. It has benefited our defence forces and has allowed us to contribute to worthwhile NATO-led, UN-mandated missions in Afghanistan, Bosnia and Kosovo, and to make a valuable contribution to peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. In the early 2000s, the then government commenced a reappraisal of both Irish defence and foreign policy. The process started with the 2000 White Paper on Defence, the first of its kind and an important milestone in the modernisation and reform of the defence forces. Given the changing nature of the global security environment and security challenges, comprehensively re-examining these issues are important. Take the issue of cyber attacks. This was not seen as a security threat of our national infrastructure over a decade ago, and yet now countries across the globe, and that includes Ireland with our valuable high-tech sector, are faced with an evolving and complex cyber threat environment. Cyber attacks are now part of a hybrid warfare. This is just one developing area which requires a more regular and closer consideration in our defence policy response. This consideration should be informed by the active neutrality approach announced back in 2006, and which I will expand on myself as defence spokesperson in the coming months. This active neutrality approach was intended to herald a new third phase in Irish foreign and defence policy. The third phase of our Irish foreign and defence policy focus historically on securing sovereignty and international recognition. The second phase concentrated on the pursuit of peace and prosperity on the island, and the 2008 global crash stymied that ambition, but is one we should update, revise and relaunch now. An active neutrality approach reflects the reality that our sovereignty is secure, our democracy is functioning well, and that we are one of the most successfully developed countries in the world. It also reflects the fact that we are at a juncture in our development where we have an enhanced opportunity to focus on what we have to offer to other members of the international community. Active neutrality says that we have a duty to share our lessons of peace building on this island and of peacekeeping on the international stage with others who may benefit from them. One such area is our acknowledged expertise in improvised ordnance device disposal. In our July 2015 defence document, A Force for Good, Fianna Fáil committed to expanding the UN training school based at the Curragh camp to become a major international academy for peacekeeping. It is time for Ireland to further develop our approach to international affairs, building on our long and proud contribution in areas such as peacekeeping and development. In an era when differences between the developed and developing worlds continue to challenge us, we have the opportunity and obligation to seek to build on our reputation as a bridge between nations. In my view, active neutrality is about reciprocal solidarity, is about making Ireland a bridge between the developed and the developing world, a global leader in the fight against poverty, disease and underdevelopment, an intermediary and facilitator in peace processes, the first on the ground in a humanitarian crisis, the model UN state for the 21st century. And the last point is key. This is not just about being a model UN member state, but being the UN model member state. And that means pursuing policies that focus on disarmament and human rights. In this regard, it is good to see the Irish government seeking a place on the UN Security Council. We do not believe that the challenges facing the international community can be satisfactorily resolved through unilateral action by any one country or group of countries. The UN remains the cornerstone of Ireland's global foreign and defence policy. This is consistent with our involvement in European Common Security and Defence Policy and indeed with PESCO. Developing an efficient approach to collective European security and defence gives the EU the operational capacity to undertake missions outside the EU for peacekeeping, conflict prevention and international security strengthening purposes in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. This is what the EU did in 2007 with the EU for Chad mission under the command of an Irish general, Major General Pat Nash. But if we want to do this fully and return to the levels of commitment we gave in the 2000s, then we must also commit to rebuild our capacity to deliver on the ground. We should return to supplying the level of troops for overseas service up to the top of the UN SAS requirement, as we had done for most of the 2000s. We should return the Defence Forces establishment figure to 10,500 and address the serious difficulties with retention we are seeing in the Defence Forces. And a lot of that relates to the issues around pay, conditions and allowances. And the Defence Forces are the last group thought of when it comes to public pay and conditions. I think they should become the primary focus in any future pay agreement, because they're leaving en masse, many of them struggling in poverty. And if we want to recognise a future defence policy, it's important that our Defence Forces morale improves from where it is today. We should start planning now for developing our defence spending and building the capacity to deal with the threats that face us now and into the future, whether they come via sea, air, land or the internet. It also means expanding our naval service. But what I will not be doing is abandoning the triple lock, specifically the requirement in the 1954, 1960 and 1993 Defence Acts that there be a UN mandate when sending a contingent of 12 or more armed Irish troops overseas. I do not favour any diminution of that requirement. Ireland's policy of military neutrality is a positive policy. Its core defining characteristic is not just our non-membership of any military alliance, but also the fact that we decide the strength, size and deployment of our defence forces for ourselves. But as I've said, let us make these decisions on the basis of an honest and factual analysis. We should not increase our defence spending simply because we want to have the shiniest new bit of weaponry, but neither should we suppress defence spending and planning because we've neither the political will nor the courage to do otherwise. Our ongoing commitment to and participation in UN-mandated peace support operations proves that our defence policy has never obligated us to sit on the sidelines and shirk our responsibilities to the international community. But our ability to deliver on our sovereign responsibilities to our national defence and our international obligations require us to put the proper resources in place. Military neutrality cannot mean military impotence. This includes developing the capacity to serve with other countries on peace support operations via improved interoperability, and this includes many of the countries who are members of NATO. I rule out Irish membership of NATO as nuclear weapons remain a core component of its overall capabilities for deterrence and defence alongside conventional and missile defence forces. But I reconfirm my commitment to working alongside many of the countries in NATO in order to deliver on our obligations. So to sum up, the Fianna Fáil active neutrality defence policy that I will pursue will be based on a multilateral approach, continue the triple lock, be designed to address the threats of the 21st century, especially cyber attacks, increase defence spending and commit to continued modernisation. I thank you all for your attention, and I thank the organisers, Joe, for giving me this opportunity to outline my thoughts and priorities as defence spokesperson for Fianna Fáil. Thank you.